Okay, so the last little bit of Section 1 has everything to do with the United States and where the U.S. was at this point in the war. Now, what you need to understand is, the textbook calls it the United States aids its allies, but realistically, the United States was still technically considered an isolationist. We are not um, advocating for war. In fact, we had passed some laws that push for us to stay neutral. In fact, there's a nickname for them called the Neutrality Acts. It's actually a series of laws aimed at keeping us neutral. It made it illegal for us to sell weapons to any nation at war, hence Neutrality Acts. So, from the outside looking in, you look at the United States, we claim to be an isolationist. We want to be separate from the world in this, let Europe deal with themselves. But realistically, maybe that wasn't the truth because here I'm going to skip forward a couple slides. Our president at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, he had persuaded Congress to use a new law, even though we had the Neutrality Acts. He had convinced Congress to use what was called the Lend-Lease Act, Lend-Lease Acts, and the idea of these laws was to circumvent the previous law, right? So we have this law called the Neutrality Acts, which makes it seem that we are a neutral nation. However, realistically, we want to help out the nations we have the closest ties to, which would be Britain, and we could find a loophole in the law so we don't aren't going to sell weapons to a nation at war, but we could lend those weapons to them, or we could lease those weapons to them, which is like a rental. Again, another way around the law. So maybe we're not as neutral as we think. And he also, let me go back here for a second. He also signed the Atlantic Charter with Churchill, meaning Roosevelt and Churchill signed the Atlantic Charter. It's called the Atlantic Charter because the Atlantic Ocean is the body of water, obviously, between Britain in the United States, and so the Atlantic Charter was used to withhold free trade. Is basically a way for both Britain and the United States to say, "Hey, we are um, allowed to trade in wartime or peacetime, where any time we want to, and you can't stop us from doing that, right?" And so we want to make sure everybody knew that we are allowed to trade. Which, why would we be advocating for that right now, other than the idea that we might be supplying Britain with some weapons or whatever to help them in their cause, which is potentially that would have been possible. Um, I also want to tell you about one other thing that's not really in the textbook, but I think it's worth us saying. Like I said, appearances can be deceiving, right? We want to have the vision of being neutral and being an isolationist, and maybe that was partially because a lot of the United States did not want to go to war yet. But in 1940, we actually passed something called the Selective Service Act, and the Selective Service Act was law that um, allowed for us to have the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. So we are drafting men into the military before us ever joining the war, which kind of made sense because our military was pretty small at the time, just so we'd be ready in case we got in it. But even so, that doesn't seem like something that a nation that wants to be neutral would do. So in 1940, we passed the Selective Service Act. By October 1940, we actually have the first men drafted, and they're supposed to sign. They're supposed to be on for a 12-month conscription, a 12-month period, and we know that went the first people through were in October 1940, which would have been through October of 1941. And what ends up happening is we're not in the war in October of 1941, and so their conscription should be over. But the U.S. government didn't allow them to be done with their conscription, and so they had a protest thing that they would say. It was actually OHIO, easy for us to remember, right? Ohio, which stood for over the hill in October, meaning that we should be done in October, but the government wasn't letting them out of their conscription. So remember, that's October of 1941. So we got October, November, December, right? So I'm going through my months, and maybe you don't know what happens in December of 1941, but you will find out in section 2. So that's what's kind of coming up. We held on to their conscription for a few months. What you need to do now is you need to answer the questions in the guided reading and answer them on your own document and turn them into the guided reading